The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore Estate as Caroline Foster stood alone in the marble foyer, her hands trembling inside the pockets of her simple black dress. Through the towering oak doors of the library, she could hear the murmur of hostile voices, the scrape of expensive chairs against hardwood floors, and the occasional bark of derisive laughter. They were all waiting for her. Waiting to watch her fall. Waiting to see the gold digger exposed. Waiting for the moment when she would be thrown out onto the street with nothing, just as they believed she deserved. Caroline closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, but her chest felt tight, constricted by more than just the anxiety of what was about to happen. She was 26 years old, and in the span of 18 months, her entire world had been built up and then shattered. Now she stood on the precipice of losing the last thread connecting her to the only person who had ever truly seen her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Caroline had met Thomas Whitmore on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Boston, in a place where their worlds should never have collided. She had been working 3 jobs at the time, barely keeping her head above water, trying to pay off the mountain of medical debt left behind after her father's long battle with cancer. Her mother had passed when Caroline was only 12, and her father had been everything to her after that. He had been a music teacher at a public school in Dorchester, a gentleman who had taught Caroline to play piano before she could properly read. Music had been the language of their household, the way they communicated love and hope and dreams. When the cancer came, it came fast and cruel. Within 2 years, her father was gone, and Caroline was left with nothing but memories and $60,000 in medical bills. She had been forced to drop out of the New England Conservatory in her junior year. The scholarship that had been paying most of her tuition disappeared when she could no longer maintain her course load while working to pay her father's expenses. Her dreams of becoming a concert pianist evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. Caroline worked as a waitress at a diner in Cambridge, cleaned offices downtown in the early morning hours, and gave piano lessons to children in their homes on weekends. She moved through her days like a ghost, exhausted and numb, playing a role that felt nothing like the life she had once imagined for herself. The piano lessons were the only part of her work that still felt real, still felt connected to who she actually was. When she sat with those children and watched their small fingers find the keys, she could almost remember what it felt like to have dreams. It was during one of those piano lessons that everything changed. Caroline had been hired to teach the granddaughter of a wealthy family in Beacon Hill. The Hendersons lived in a historic brownstone with a music room that housed a stunning Steinway grand piano. 8-year-old Lucy Henderson was a bright child with natural talent, and Caroline had been working with her for about 3 months when Thomas Whitmore arrived at the house one afternoon. He had been a friend of the Henderson family, stopping by to drop off some business documents for Mr. Henderson. Thomas was 72 years old, with silver hair, kind blue eyes, and a gentle demeanor that immediately put people at ease. He had paused outside the music room door, listening to Caroline guide Lucy through a simplified version of Für Elise. When the lesson ended and Caroline stepped into the hallway, she found him standing there with tears in his eyes. Caroline had been startled, uncertain how to respond to this elegant stranger who was crying in the Hendersons' hallway. Thomas had apologized immediately, embarrassed by his emotional response. He explained that his late wife, Margaret, had loved that particular piece. She had been a pianist herself, though she had never pursued it professionally. Hearing it played so beautifully had transported him back to evenings spent listening to Margaret play in their home. The memory had overwhelmed him. They had talked for only a few minutes that day, but something had shifted in that brief conversation. Thomas had a warmth about him, a genuine interest in others that was rare among people of his social class. He asked Caroline about her teaching, about her own training. When she mentioned she had attended the conservatory, his eyes had lit up with interest. Before he left, he had asked if she might consider giving him piano lessons. He said he had always wanted to learn but had never made the time. Now, in the twilight of his life, he wanted to finally pursue that small dream. Caroline had agreed, though she suspected even then that his interest was more about kindness than genuine desire to learn piano. Thomas Whitmore was the founder and former CEO of Whitmore Technologies, a software company that had revolutionized data security systems in the early days of the Internet. He was worth an estimated $3 billion. He did not need piano lessons from a struggling teacher in her 20s. But he had seen Sincere, and Caroline needed the work. Their lessons began the following week at the Whitmore Estate in Brookline. The house was massive, a Georgian-style mansion set on 5 acres of manicured grounds. Caroline had felt completely out of place the first time she arrived, her 15-year-old Honda Civic looking absurd parked in the circular driveway beside the fountain. But Thomas had greeted her at the door himself, refusing to let the household staff treat her as a mere employee. He had insisted she call him Thomas, not Mr. Whitmore. The piano in his music room was extraordinary, a concert grand Bosendorfer that had belonged to his wife. Thomas explained that no one had played it since Margaret's death 5 years earlier. He had kept the room exactly as she had left it, unable to change anything, unable to let go. But now, he said, it was time. The piano needed to be played. Music needed to fill the house again. Those first lessons had been awkward. Thomas had no natural aptitude for piano, and his elderly fingers struggled to find the correct keys. But he approached each lesson with humor and determination, laughing at his mistakes and celebrating his small victories. Caroline found herself looking forward to their sessions, not because of the generous payment he insisted on giving her, but because of Thomas himself. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, wealthy beyond imagination but utterly without pretension. He asked about her life, her father, her abandoned dreams. He listened with genuine attention when she spoke, as if her words actually mattered. After 3 months of lessons, Thomas had stopped even pretending to practice between sessions. Instead, he would ask Caroline to play for him. He would sit in the leather chair by the window, close his eyes, and listen as she brought the Bosendorfer to life. She played Chopin and Rachmaninoff, Debussy and Liszt. She played pieces she had not touched since leaving the conservatory, pieces that had once been destined for recital halls and competitions. And Thomas would listen with tears streaming down his weathered face, transported by the music to memories of his beloved Margaret. It was during one of those sessions that Thomas had told Caroline the truth. He was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 6 months earlier. He had perhaps a year left, maybe less. He had not told his family yet, not told anyone except his doctors. He was dreading the conversation, dreading the way his children would look at him, the way everything would change once they knew. But he wanted Caroline to know. He wanted her to understand why these hours with her, listening to music in Margaret's room, meant so much to him. They were a respite from the knowledge of his own mortality, a brief escape into beauty and grace. Caroline had been devastated by the news. In just 3 months, Thomas had become important to her, a father figure filling the void left by her own father's death. She had cried when he told her, and Thomas had held her hand and comforted her, even though he was the one who was dying. That moment had cemented their bond, had transformed their relationship from teacher and student into something deeper. They became friends, true friends, despite the enormous gap in their ages and circumstances. As Thomas's condition worsened over the following months, Caroline's role in his life expanded. She began visiting him several times a week, not for lessons but simply to keep him company. She would play for him when he felt well enough to listen, or read to him when he was too weak to get out of bed. She met his private nurses, learned his medication schedule, and became a familiar presence in the Whitmore household. The staff treated her with kindness, grateful that someone was bringing joy to their employer's final days. It was during this time that Caroline met Thomas's children for the first time, and the experience had been jarring. Thomas had 3 adult children from his marriage to Margaret. Richard was 51, the eldest, a corporate attorney who had always expected to inherit control of his father's company. Victoria was 48, twice divorced, living off family trusts and spending her time on charity galas and social climbing. And there was James, the youngest at 43, who had never held a real job in his life and cycled through expensive hobbies and failed business ventures funded by his father's money. When Richard, Victoria, and James learned about Caroline, their reactions had been immediate and hostile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They saw her as an opportunist, a conniving young woman who had manipulated her way into their dying father's life. The fact that she was young and attractive made it worse in their eyes. They could not comprehend that their father might genuinely care for someone outside their social circle, that he might find comfort in Caroline's company for reasons that had nothing to do with money or inheritance. Richard had confronted Caroline directly, cornering her in the hallway after one of her visits. He had been coldly polite but unmistakably threatening, suggesting that she should stop visiting his father, that her presence was inappropriate and possibly exploitative. He implied that if she were smart, she would walk away before things became complicated. Caroline had been shaken by the encounter but refused to abandon Thomas. When she told him what had happened, Thomas had been furious. He called his children to the house and made it clear that Caroline was welcome in his home any time she wished, and that they were to treat her with respect. But the damage had been done. From that point forward, Richard, Victoria, and James watched Caroline with open suspicion and barely concealed contempt. They began showing up at the estate more frequently, monitoring their father's visitors, questioning the staff about Caroline's activities. They hired a private investigator to look into her background, searching for evidence of criminal behavior or evidence that she was trying to unduly influence their father. They found nothing because there was nothing to find, but their suspicion only deepened. What none of them knew, what no one could have predicted, was what happened 9 months after Caroline and Thomas first met. Thomas, knowing his time was limited and wanting to do something meaningful with what remained of his life, had asked Caroline to marry him. The proposal had not been romantic in the traditional sense. There had been no declaration of passionate love, no getting down on one knee. Thomas had simply taken Caroline's hand one afternoon as she sat beside his bed and told her that he wanted to take care of her, wanted to ensure that she would be financially secure after he was gone. He said she had given him more happiness in the past months than he had known since Margaret's death, and he wanted to repay that kindness. Caroline had been shocked, overwhelmed, uncertain how to respond. She cared deeply for Thomas, loved him in the way one loves a dear friend or mentor, but she was not in love with him. She had told him this directly, not wanting there to be any misunderstanding. Thomas had smiled and said he knew that he was not expecting romantic love. He simply wanted to help her, to give her the financial freedom to pursue her dreams again, to finish her degree, to become the pianist she was meant to be. He wanted to do this because she had brought light into his darkest days, and because he had the means to change her life if she would let him. Caroline had refused at first, insisting it was too much, that she could not accept such generosity. But Thomas had been persistent. He explained that his children were already wealthy beyond measure, set up with trust funds and inheritances that would sustain them for multiple lifetimes. They did not need more money. But Caroline needed help, needed a chance to rebuild the life that had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. He wanted to give her that chance. He said it would make him happy, would give his remaining time greater purpose and meaning. After days of consideration, Caroline had agreed, but only with certain conditions. She insisted on a prenuptial agreement that would limit what she could inherit, wanted everything documented and legal so there could be no question of her intentions. Thomas had agreed to her terms, though he tried to be more generous than she wanted. They were married quietly in a civil ceremony with only 2 witnesses, both members of Thomas's household staff who had known him for decades. The marriage lasted only 7 months before Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep. Caroline had been there at the end, holding his hand, playing soft music on the Bosendorfer in the next room as he drifted away. His children had not arrived in time. They had been notified, but Richard had been in London on business, Victoria had been at a spa in Arizona, and James had been unreachable, likely drunk or high somewhere. By the time they rushed to the estate, their father was already gone, and Caroline was sitting beside his body, crying. The funeral had been a nightmare. Richard, Victoria, and James had been consumed by grief and rage, and they directed much of that rage at Caroline. At the reception following the service, Victoria had publicly accused Caroline of manipulating their father, of taking advantage of a sick old man. Richard had made veiled threats about contesting the will. James had gotten drunk and called Caroline a whore in front of a room full of Boston's elite. Caroline had endured it all in numb silence, too grief-stricken over losing Thomas to defend herself. Now, 2 weeks after the funeral, Caroline stood in the foyer of the Whitmore Estate, waiting to enter the library for the reading of Thomas's will. She knew what was coming. She knew that whatever Thomas had left her would be seen as proof of her gold-digging ways. She knew that his children would fight her with every legal resource at their disposal. She knew that the press, which had already gotten wind of the story, would paint her as a villain, a scheming young woman who had trapped a vulnerable elderly billionaire. But what none of them knew, what Caroline had never told anyone, was that she did not want Thomas's money. She had loved him as a friend, as a surrogate father, as one of the kindest people she had ever known. His generosity had already given her more than she ever expected. In the months of their marriage, Thomas had paid off all her father's medical debts, had set up a small trust that would allow her to return to the conservatory if she wished. That had been enough. That had been more than enough. Whatever else Thomas had left her, Caroline had already decided to refuse it. She would take only what she needed to finish her education and support herself modestly while she rebuilt her life. The rest she would let his children have. She did not want to fight them. She did not want their money. She just wanted to grieve for the man who had changed her life, who had seen her worth when she had almost forgotten it herself. The library door opened, and Thomas's attorney, Gerald Morrison, appeared in the doorway. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He had been Thomas's friend for over 30 years and had handled all his legal affairs. He gave Caroline a sympathetic look, understanding the ordeal she was about to face. "Caroline," he said gently, "we're ready for you now." Caroline straightened her shoulders and walked through the door into the library. The room was enormous, with walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. A massive mahogany desk dominated the far end, and arranged in front of it were several rows of chairs. Most of them were filled. Richard sat in the front row with his wife, Diane, a thin woman with platinum blonde hair and a permanent expression of disapproval. Victoria sat beside them, dressed in black Chanel and diamonds, her face a mask of cold fury. James slouched in the chair next to Victoria, his eyes bloodshot, a flask visible in his jacket pocket. Behind them sat various other relatives and associates, Thomas's brother Edward and his wife, several cousins, a handful of executives from Whitmore Technologies, and Thomas's personal assistant of 20 years, Margaret Chen. They all turned to look at Caroline as she entered, and the hostility in the room was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence. Caroline took a seat in the back row, as far from the family as possible. She folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Gerald Morrison walked to the desk and opened a leather portfolio containing Thomas's will. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "We are gathered here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Thomas Arthur Whitmore," Gerald began, his voice formal and measured. "Before we begin with the specific bequests, I want to note that this will was executed 8 months ago, and Mr. Whitmore was of sound mind and body at the time. It was witnessed by myself and 2 other attorneys, and it reflects his clear and stated wishes. Any challenges to this document will need to overcome substantial legal hurdles." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his jaw clenched. Victoria's fingers gripped the arms of her seat. James took a swig from his flask. Gerald continued reading, starting with the smaller bequests. Generous donations to various charities, gifts to long-serving staff members, specific items left to friends and colleagues. Each bequest was met with polite nods or murmured thanks. Then Gerald reached the major provisions of the will. "To my son Richard Whitmore," Gerald read, "I leave my 50% ownership stake in Whitmore Technologies, as well as the sum of $10 million in liquid assets. Richard, you have always been the most business-minded of my children, and I trust you will lead the company well." Richard's face remained impassive, but Caroline could see the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. $10 million was far less than he probably expected, but control of the company was what he truly wanted. To my daughter Victoria Whitmore Klein, Gerald continued, I leave the property in Nantucket, the art collection housed therein, and the sum of $10 million in liquid assets. Victoria, I hope you will find peace and purpose in the years ahead. Victoria's mouth tightened into a thin line. The Nantucket house was valuable, worth perhaps $20 million, and the art collection was worth another $15. Combined with the $10 million cash, she was receiving roughly $45 million. It was a fortune by any measure, but Caroline could see it was not what Victoria had expected. To my son James Whitmore, Gerald read, I leave the property in Aspen, the collection of vintage automobiles, and the sum of $5 million in liquid assets, to be distributed in annual installments of $500,000 over 10 years. James, I hope this structure will help you find stability and direction. James shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. $5 million? He shouted. In installments? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Gerald looked at him calmly. Mr. Whitmore felt that a structured distribution would be in your best interest, James. Please sit down. James remained standing, swaying slightly. This is bullshit. That gold-digging bitch probably convinced him to cut me out. Richard reached up and yanked his brother back into his seat, hissing something in his ear. James fell silent but continued glaring at Caroline with undisguised hatred. Gerald waited for the disruption to settle before continuing. To my beloved wife, Caroline Whitmore, Gerald said, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Caroline felt her heart hammering in her chest. This was the moment that would define how the family saw her forever. I leave the Brookline estate and all its contents, including the music room and the Bosendorfer piano. I leave her the sum of $50 million in liquid assets, to be placed in a trust that she may access without restriction. Additionally, I leave her my personal collection of musical recordings and manuscripts, and I ask that she continue to share her extraordinary gift with the world. The room exploded. Victoria shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure rage. Richard was on his feet, shouting at Gerald that the will must be invalid, that Caroline had clearly manipulated his father. James was cursing incoherently, being physically restrained by Richard's wife. The other relatives looked shocked, scandalized, thrilled by the drama unfolding before them. Caroline sat frozen in her chair, unable to process what she had just heard. $50 million. The estate. It was too much, far too much. She had never wanted this. She had never asked for this. Thomas had promised her he would provide for her education, help her get back on her feet. This was not getting back on her feet. This was making her a target, painting a bullseye on her back for Thomas's children and the entire world to see. This is unacceptable, Richard was saying, his voice cutting through the chaos. My father was clearly not in his right mind. This woman manipulated him, isolated him from his family, took advantage of his illness and grief. Mr. Whitmore, Gerald said firmly, your father was examined by 3 independent physicians before executing this will. All 3 confirmed he was mentally competent. His wishes were clear. Victoria turned in her seat to glare at Caroline with pure venom in her eyes. You think you've won, she hissed. You think you can just waltz in here and steal our father's fortune? We will fight you. We will drag you through every court in this country. We will destroy you. Caroline finally found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. I don't want it. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at her. Victoria's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What did you say? Caroline stood up, her legs shaking. I said I don't want it. I never wanted your father's money. I loved him as a friend, and he was generous to me, more generous than I deserved. But this, she gestured to the will, this is too much. I don't need $50 million. I don't need the estate. I just wanted to finish my education and have a chance to rebuild my life. Richard laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Oh, how noble. The little gold digger pretends she doesn't want the money. Do you really expect us to believe that? You married our father on his deathbed. You isolated him from his family. And now you want us to think you did it all out of the goodness of your heart? I never isolated him from anyone, Caroline said, her voice growing stronger. Your father invited me into his life. He asked me to marry him, not the other way around. And I was there for him at the end because I cared about him, not because I wanted his money. You can believe that or not. I don't care anymore. Then prove it, Victoria said, rising from her seat. Prove you don't want the money. Refuse the inheritance. Walk away from all of it. Right now. Caroline looked at Gerald. Can I do that? Can I refuse the inheritance? Gerald looked troubled. Legally, yes, you can disclaim an inheritance. But Mrs. Whitmore, I would strongly advise you to take some time to consider this decision. Your late husband wanted you to have these assets. He spent considerable time thinking about how to provide for you. I've already decided, Caroline said. I don't want the 50 million. I don't want the estate. The only things I want are the piano and the music collection, because those meant something to Thomas and they mean something to me. Everything else can go to his children. The library was utterly silent. Richard, Victoria, and James stared at Caroline with expressions of confused suspicion, unable to comprehend why anyone would turn down $50 million. Gerald looked at Caroline with something like respect. Mrs. Whitmore, are you certain? Gerald asked. Once you disclaim the inheritance, you cannot change your mind. I'm certain, Caroline said. Please draw up whatever papers I need to sign. Before Gerald could respond, Richard spoke up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How convenient. She keeps the estate and the piano. Do you know how much that property is worth? At least 40 million. So she's not actually giving up anything. She's just trying to look noble while still walking away with a fortune. Caroline turned to face him directly. I said I don't want the estate. I want the piano because it was your mother's and because Thomas asked me to play it. If you want, I'll pay fair market rent for storage space to keep it until I have my own place. The estate itself should go to you and your siblings. I don't want it. Victoria stood up and walked toward Caroline, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She stopped just a few feet away, studying Caroline's face as if trying to see through to her true intentions. You really expect us to believe you married our father for love? That you sat there day after day, playing piano for a dying old man, and never once thought about his money? Caroline met her gaze steadily. I thought about it. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. Your father was a billionaire, and I was drowning in debt. Of course the thought crossed my mind. But I never asked him for anything. He offered to help me because he wanted to, because he was kind, because making other people happy brought him joy. That's who he was. And I loved him for it. Prove it, James slurred from his seat. Prove you're not just another lying, scheming. That's enough, James, Richard snapped. He turned back to Caroline, his expression calculating. You say you'll give up the estate and the money. Fine. But if you're truly innocent, if you truly cared about our father and not his fortune, then prove it to all of us right now. Richard walked to the corner of the library where a sheet covered something large. He pulled the sheet away, revealing another piano, a smaller upright that had been moved into the room. Our father always said that music revealed a person's soul. He said you couldn't lie through music, that whatever was truly in your heart would come out through the keys. So play for us. Play something right now, and let us hear what's really in your heart. Let us see if you're genuine or just a talented actress. Caroline looked at the piano, then back at Richard. You want me to audition my grief? You want me to perform for you like some kind of trained animal to prove I loved your father? I want you to show us who you really are, Richard said coldly. Because if you refuse, if you walk out of here without playing, then we'll know you're a fraud. We'll know that every moment you spent with our father was calculated, that every tear you shed was an act. But if you play, if you show us what our father heard in you, then maybe, just maybe, we'll believe you. Caroline looked around the room at the faces staring at her with hostility and suspicion. She thought about Thomas, about the hours they had spent together in the music room, about the way he had listened to her play with tears of joy streaming down his face. She thought about her father, about the piano lessons in their small apartment, about the dreams that had been stolen by medical bills and bad luck. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had found in her friendship with Thomas. She walked to the piano and sat down. The bench was hard and uncomfortable, nothing like the beautiful bench that accompanied the Bosendorfer. The piano itself was old and probably out of tune. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered except the music. Caroline placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. She took a deep breath, and then she began to play. Caroline's fingers touched the keys with a gentleness that surprised even herself. The piano was indeed out of tune, the action stiff from lack of use, but her hands knew what to do. They had played through worse conditions, through tears and exhaustion, through grief and loss. This moment was no different. She began with Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the first movement, a piece that had always spoken to her of quiet sorrow and dignity in the face of suffering. The opening notes filled the library with a hushed, contemplative sound. The anger and chaos that had dominated the room just moments before seemed to dissolve as the music began. Caroline felt the familiar sensation of the world falling away, of everything narrowing down to just herself and the instrument beneath her fingers. She was no longer in a room full of people who hated her. She was no longer the accused gold digger facing a hostile family. She was simply a woman at a piano, telling a story the only way she knew how. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata was deceptively simple, built on arpeggiated triplets that created a sense of gentle, rolling motion, like moonlight on water. But within that simplicity lay profound emotional depth. Caroline poured everything into those notes. Her grief over losing Thomas. Her exhaustion from months of being vilified and attacked. Her sorrow at having her intentions questioned and her character dragged through the mud. Her anger at a world that assumed the worst about her simply because she was young and poor and had dared to accept kindness from someone wealthy. As she played, Caroline became aware that the room had gone completely silent. No one was moving. No one was whispering. Even James had stopped his drunken muttering. They were all listening, really listening, perhaps for the first time since she had entered their lives. Caroline moved into the second movement, a brief intermezzo that provided contrast to the melancholy of the first. Her fingers danced across the keys with more lightness here, more delicacy. This section always reminded her of a moment of respite, a brief pause in sorrow where one could catch one's breath and remember that beauty still existed in the world. She thought of Thomas as she played. She remembered the first time she had performed this piece for him, about 4 months into their friendship. He had been having a difficult day, the cancer pain breaking through his medication, leaving him irritable and uncomfortable. Caroline had sat at the Bosendorfer and played the Moonlight Sonata, and by the end, Thomas had been calm again, the tension gone from his face. He had told her that Beethoven had written this piece after losing someone he loved, and that loss was woven into every note. That's what makes it so powerful, Thomas had said. The composer's heart is completely exposed. There's no artifice, no pretending. Just pure, honest feeling. Caroline moved into the third movement, and this was where the piece transformed entirely. The gentle, contemplative mood of the first 2 movements gave way to a torrent of passionate, almost violent emotion. This movement was technically demanding, requiring speed, precision, and tremendous physical stamina. Caroline's hands flew across the keyboard, her fingers striking the keys with controlled fury. The music was turbulent, stormy, full of rage and defiance. It was Beethoven shaking his fist at fate, refusing to go gently into the darkness. As Caroline played, she felt her own anger rising to meet the music. She was tired of being judged. Tired of defending herself. Tired of having to prove that her feelings were real, that her grief was legitimate, that she had loved Thomas without ulterior motives. Why was it so impossible for these people to believe that genuine human connection could exist across boundaries of age and wealth? Why did they assume that every act of kindness had to be a transaction, that every relationship had to be calculated? Her fingers pounded the keys with increasing intensity. The old piano protested slightly, the strings vibrating with sounds it had probably not produced in years. But Caroline didn't hold back. She couldn't. This piece demanded everything, and she gave it everything. All her frustration, all her pain, all her defiance poured out through her hands. She was playing not just for the Whitmore family but for everyone who had ever been misjudged, everyone who had ever been accused of being something they weren't, everyone who had ever loved someone and been told that love wasn't real. The music built to its climactic conclusion, a series of powerful chords that seemed to shake the very air in the library. Caroline's entire body was engaged now, her shoulders and back moving with the force of the music, her feet working the pedals to sustain and release the sound at precisely the right moments. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the coolness of the room. Her arms ached from the exertion, but she pushed through, driving toward the final resolution. And then, with one last powerful chord, it was over. The sound rang out and slowly faded into silence. Caroline's hands remained on the keys for a moment, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. She had played the entire Moonlight Sonata, all 3 movements, without pause. It had taken nearly 15 minutes, and she had given it absolutely everything she had. Slowly, Caroline lifted her hands from the piano and placed them in her lap. She kept her eyes closed, not yet ready to face the people in the room, not yet ready to see their judgment and condemnation. For just a moment longer, she wanted to stay in that space where only the music mattered. But reality could not be held at bay forever. Caroline opened her eyes and turned to face the room. What she saw stunned her into speechlessness. Victoria was crying. Not delicate, pretty tears but raw, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. Her carefully applied makeup was running down her face in dark streaks, and she made no attempt to wipe it away. She simply sat in her chair with her hands pressed to her mouth, crying as if something inside her had broken open. Richard's face had gone pale, his expression stripped of its customary arrogance and calculation. He stared at Caroline with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, perhaps. Or recognition. Or shame. James had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. At first, Caroline thought he might be laughing, that this might be some cruel joke, but then she realized he was crying too. Even the other people in the room, the relatives and associates who had watched the drama unfold with voyeuristic interest, were visibly moved. Margaret Chen, Thomas's longtime assistant, had tears streaming down her face. Edward Whitmore, Thomas's brother, was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Gerald Morrison stood behind the desk with his hand over his heart, looking at Caroline with an expression of profound respect. He had known Thomas for 3 decades. He had heard Margaret play in this very house years ago. And now he had heard Caroline, and he understood exactly why Thomas had loved her, why he had wanted to give her everything. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. No one seemed to know what to say or do. The performance had shifted something fundamental in the room, had torn down walls that anger and accusations had built up. Music had done what words could not. It had revealed truth. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice broken and hoarse from crying. I heard my mother in that. I don't know how, but I heard her. The way she used to play when she thought no one was listening. The way she would sit at the piano late at night when she couldn't sleep. I haven't thought about that in years. I had forgotten. She looked at Caroline with eyes that were still hostile but now held something else as well. Confusion, perhaps. A reluctant acknowledgement that she might have been wrong about something. Did our father, Victoria's voice caught, did he hear that too? Did he hear our mother in your playing? Caroline's own eyes filled with tears. Thomas talked about your mother all the time. He told me how she played, how she would lose herself in the music just like I do. He said listening to me reminded him of her, of the happiest years of his life. That's why he wanted me to have the Bosendorfer. Not because of its monetary value, but because it was hers. Because music connected all of us, across time, across death. Because that piano was meant to be played by someone who understood what it meant. Richard stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to the room. When he spoke, his voice was tight with emotion. Our father tried to talk to us in the last year of his life. He tried to tell us about you, about how important you had become to him. But we wouldn't listen. We assumed the worst. We were so convinced that you were taking advantage of him that we couldn't hear what he was actually saying. We couldn't see that he was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time since our mother died. Richard turned to face Caroline, and there were tears on his face now too. I'm sorry. I'm sorry we treated you the way we did. I'm sorry we made assumptions. I'm sorry we weren't there when he died because we were too busy being angry at you to be present for him. That's on us, not you. Caroline stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. She wanted to accept Richard's apology gracefully, wanted to be magnanimous and forgiving, but the months of abuse and accusation had taken their toll. I appreciate you saying that. But you need to understand what you put me through. You had me followed by private investigators. You spread rumors about me to your father's friends and associates. You made me feel like a criminal just for caring about someone. And through all of it, I never fought back. I never defended myself in the press or tried to turn Thomas against you. I just endured it because I knew you were grieving and afraid of losing him. I know, Richard said quietly. And that makes what we did even worse. You showed us grace, and we responded with cruelty. There's no excuse for that. James lifted his head from his hands, his face blotchy and red. I called you a whore at the funeral. I was drunk, but that's no excuse. I said horrible things about you to anyone who would listen. I wanted to destroy your reputation because I was angry that Dad cared about you more than he seemed to care about me. But the truth is, he did care about me. He just knew I was wasting my life and he was trying to help me. I was too messed up to see it. Victoria stood and walked toward Caroline slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped and looked Caroline directly in the eyes. I need to know something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you love our father? Not romantically, I understand that. But did you genuinely care about him as a person? Caroline didn't hesitate. Yes. I loved him deeply. He was one of the best people I've ever known. He saw me when I felt invisible. He believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. He gave me back my future when I thought I had lost it forever. I would have given anything to have more time with him. His death broke my heart, and not because of money or inheritances. Because I lost someone irreplaceable. Victoria's face crumpled, and she began crying again. She reached out and pulled Caroline into an embrace, holding her tightly as they both wept. I'm so sorry, Victoria whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. You made my father happy. You gave him joy in his final months. That's all that should have mattered, and instead we made your life hell. Can you ever forgive us? Caroline hugged her back, feeling some of the tension and anger she had been carrying finally begin to release. I can forgive you. I already have. We were all in pain. We all handled it badly. Let's not compound the tragedy by holding on to resentment. They stood like that for a long moment, two women who should have been enemies but who were now united in their grief for the man they had both loved. When they finally separated, Richard and James had moved closer as well. Richard extended his hand to Caroline, and she shook it. James looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, so he just nodded at her, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Gerald Morrison cleared his throat gently, reminding them all that the legal matter at hand had not yet been resolved. Mrs. Whitmore, I want to reiterate that you do not have to make any decisions about the inheritance today. You have time to consider your options. Your late husband's wishes were clear, and this will is legally sound. No one in this room has the power to force you to give up what he left you. Caroline looked at Richard, Victoria, and James, saw the raw hope in their faces mixed with genuine remorse. She thought about what Thomas would want, what would honor his memory best. The truth was, she didn't need $50 million. She had never needed it. What she needed was the freedom to pursue her music without the crushing weight of financial desperation. What she needed was a chance to complete her education and build a life that had meaning beyond just survival. I meant what I said earlier. I don't want the 50 million or the estate. But I would like to keep the Bosendorfer and the music collection, as I said. And I'd like to ask for something else, something that's not in the will but that would mean more to me than any amount of money. Caroline paused, gathering her courage. Your father set up a small trust for me before he died, enough to pay off my debts and cover my expenses while I finish my degree. That trust is separate from the will. What I'd like is for the family to honor an idea that Thomas and I discussed before he passed. He wanted to establish a music scholarship fund at the New England Conservatory, specifically for talented students who can't afford tuition. Students like I was. Students who have the ability but not the resources. Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger. Thomas wanted to call it the Margaret Whitmore Memorial Music Scholarship, after your mother. He wanted to help young musicians who might otherwise have to give up their dreams because of money. If the family would be willing to fund that scholarship using part of what Thomas left me, I think that would be the best way to honor both of your parents. It would mean something. It would do actual good in the world instead of just sitting in a bank account. Richard looked at his siblings, and some unspoken communication passed between them. We can do better than that. We'll fund the scholarship ourselves, using our own inheritances. The Margaret and Thomas Whitmore Memorial Music Scholarship. We'll endow it fully so it can support students in perpetuity. And you'll help us run it. You'll be on the selection committee, help us choose the recipients. You'll make sure we're honoring our parents the right way. Victoria nodded enthusiastically. And you'll keep everything Dad left you. The money, the estate, all of it. You've more than earned it, Caroline. Not by manipulating him or taking advantage, but by being exactly who you are. By bringing music and joy into his life when he needed it most. Please, take what he wanted you to have. Let us make this right. Caroline felt overwhelmed by the sudden reversal, by the genuine contrition and generosity being offered. She had walked into this room expecting a battle, expecting to leave with nothing, expecting to be destroyed by the family's accusations. Instead, she had found something she hadn't anticipated, forgiveness, understanding, and the beginnings of what might eventually become a real relationship with Thomas's children. But she still couldn't bring herself to accept the full inheritance. It was too much, too complicated, too likely to breed resentment down the line even with the best intentions. Let's compromise. I'll accept the estate because it has the music room and the piano, and that does mean something to me. But the 50 million should be split among the three of you. Add it to what you've already inherited. Use it to fund the scholarship, to support causes that mattered to your father, to do good in his name. That feels right to me. That feels like what Thomas would actually want. Richard started to protest, but Caroline held up her hand. Please. Let me do this my way. I don't need to be wealthy. I just need to be free to pursue my music and to honor the memory of two people who believed in me, my father and your father. This compromise does that. It lets me keep what has sentimental value, and it lets you do something meaningful with the rest. Can we agree on that? Gerald Morrison interjected before anyone could respond. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to point out some practical considerations. The estate requires significant upkeep. Property taxes, maintenance, staff salaries if you choose to retain them. You'll need substantial resources to maintain it. Perhaps a middle ground would be to accept enough of the monetary inheritance to cover those expenses, with the rest distributed as you suggest. Caroline considered this, recognizing the wisdom in Gerald's words. All right. Whatever amount is needed to maintain the estate for the next 10 years, I'll accept that. The rest can be redistributed to Richard, Victoria, and James. Does that work for everyone? The three siblings looked at each other, and Caroline could see they wanted to argue, wanted to insist she take more. But they also seemed to understand that this was important to her, that her integrity and sense of self-worth were tied up in not being seen as someone who had married for money. Finally, Richard nodded. If that's what you want, we'll respect it. But I want it on the record that you are giving up a fortune that was rightfully yours. You are not being forced to do this. This is your choice." "It's my choice," Caroline confirmed. "And I'm at peace with it." "Gerald, can you draw up the paperwork to make this official?" Gerald nodded, making notes in the margin of the will documents. "I'll have amended documents prepared within the week. Everyone will need to sign off on the changes, but given the unanimous agreement in this room, I don't anticipate any problems." He looked at Caroline with something approaching fatherly affection. "Your late husband would be very proud of you, Mrs. Whitmore. You've handled this with remarkable grace." The formal portion of the meeting concluded, and people began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave. But before anyone could exit the library, Edward Whitmore, Thomas's brother, spoke up. He had been silent throughout the entire proceeding, watching and listening. Edward was 70 years old, a retired professor of literature who had always been the more thoughtful and less business-oriented of the Whitmore brothers. "Before everyone leaves, I think we should acknowledge something. What happened here today was extraordinary. Caroline's performance didn't just demonstrate her musical ability. It cut through all our defenses, all our preconceptions, all our anger and suspicion. It forced us to actually see her, to recognize her humanity and her genuine feelings for Thomas. Music did what words and logic couldn't. It revealed truth." Edward walked over to Caroline and took her hand gently. "My brother's greatest regret in life was that he didn't spend more time with Margaret before she died, that he was too focused on building his business to appreciate what he had. He told me many times in his final year that meeting you had given him a second chance, an opportunity to do better, to prioritize what actually mattered. You gave him that gift, Caroline. You let him be the man he wished he had been with Margaret. That's worth more than any amount of money." Caroline felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you for saying that. It means everything. To know that Thomas felt that way, that our time together mattered to him as much as it mattered to me." Edward patted her hand and stepped back. "The family owes you a debt we can never fully repay. I hope in time we can move past this painful beginning and become something like a family to you. You are, after all, legally my sister-in-law. It would be nice to actually have a relationship with you." "I'd like that too," Caroline said softly. "I'd like that very much." People began filing out of the library, several stopping to speak quietly with Caroline on their way out. Margaret Chin hugged her tightly and whispered that Thomas had been right about her, that she was special. Several of the Whitmore Technologies executives introduced themselves and said they hoped to see her at company functions. Even Diane, Richard's wife, who had been coldly silent throughout the entire proceeding, managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement as she left. Finally, only Caroline, Richard, Victoria, James, and Gerald remained in the library. The four people who had been at war just an hour ago now stood in awkward but genuine détente. James spoke first, his voice rough from crying and drinking but surprisingly sincere. "I need to get help. I can see that now. Dad was trying to tell me that with the way he structured my inheritance, and I was too messed up to hear it. But I hear it now. I'm going to check into rehab. I'm going to try to become someone he could be proud of." "That's good, James," Victoria said, reaching out to squeeze her brother's arm. "We'll support you through it." Richard nodded agreement. "We're family. We're supposed to help each other, even when we've been terrible to each other. Especially then." Richard turned to Caroline. "I know we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust. But I'd like to try, if you're willing. Maybe we could start by having you come to dinner next week? Diane and I would like to get to know you properly, without all the anger and assumptions. Our kids, your step-nieces and step-nephews, should meet you too." Caroline was surprised by how much the invitation meant to her. She had prepared herself to walk away from this family entirely, to take what she needed and disappear from their lives. But the possibility of actually belonging, of having a connection to Thomas through his children and grandchildren, was unexpectedly appealing. "I'd like that. Thank you for asking." Victoria pulled out her phone. "Give me your number. I want to take you shopping next week." You need better clothes for the kind of life you're going to be living now, whether you want to admit it or not. You're wealthy, Caroline, even with your generous redistribution of the inheritance. You're going to be attending events, sitting on charitable boards, being photographed at galas. Let me help you navigate that world. I've been doing it my whole life. Caroline hesitated, uncomfortable with the idea of charity, but Victoria seemed to sense her reluctance. I'm not offering because I think you need saving. I'm offering because I'm good at this stuff and you're not, and that's okay. We all have different skills. You have music. I have social navigation. Let's help each other. Caroline smiled and recited her phone number, which Victoria entered into her contacts. The gesture was small but significant. An hour ago, Victoria would have sooner deleted Caroline from existence than saved her contact information. Gerald Morrison began packing up his documents, but before he left, he handed Caroline a sealed envelope. This is from Thomas. He asked me to give it to you after the will was read, regardless of the outcome. He said you'd need it. Caroline took the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing Thomas's handwriting on the front. She pressed it to her chest, not yet ready to open it in front of others. Thank you, Gerald. For everything. For defending Thomas's wishes. For treating me with respect when others wouldn't. Gerald smiled warmly. Thomas was my friend. I saw how happy you made him. That was all the proof I needed. He patted her shoulder and left the library, leaving Caroline alone with Richard, Victoria, and James. The three siblings looked at each other, then at Caroline, as if none of them quite knew how to end this unexpected reconciliation. Finally, Richard broke the silence. Caroline, I just want to say one more time that I'm sorry. For all of it. The investigators, the rumors, the hostility. I was protecting what I thought was my family's interest, but I was really just being a controlling ass who couldn't accept that my father had made his own choices. I robbed myself of the chance to know him better in his final months because I was too busy being angry at you. That's something I'll have to live with. We all will, Victoria added quietly. We all missed opportunities with Dad because we were too caught up in our own stuff. But maybe we can learn from that. Maybe we can do better going forward. With each other. With you. With the memory of what Dad tried to teach us. James, who had been mostly quiet, spoke up with surprising clarity. Dad used to tell me that life was too short to waste on anger and resentment. He said that every day spent being bitter was a day you couldn't get back. I never understood what he meant until now. I've wasted so much time being angry at everyone, including myself. I don't want to waste any more. The four of them stood in the library where Thomas's will had been read, where Caroline's performance had changed everything, and in that moment, they were not adversaries or strangers. They were four people bound together by their connection to someone they had all loved, trying to find a way forward through grief and guilt and unexpected grace. They exchanged a few more words, made tentative plans to meet again, and then finally went their separate ways. Caroline found herself alone in the library at last. She walked back to the piano where she had played, where she had poured out her heart and somehow reached through the walls of anger that surrounded Thomas's children. She sat down on the bench again and opened the envelope Thomas had left for her. Inside was a letter in his distinctive handwriting, slightly shaky from the illness but still clearly his. My dearest Caroline, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have just endured what was probably one of the most difficult experiences of your life. I am sorry I could not be there to protect you from my children's anger. I know they will not understand at first. I know they will accuse you of terrible things. I know they will make you question whether our friendship was real or worth all the pain it will cause you. But I need you to know something, Caroline. You saved my life. Not literally, of course. The cancer was going to take me regardless. But you saved the last year of my life from being consumed by fear and regret. You gave me joy. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to wake up each morning despite the pain. You reminded me what it felt like to be fully alive. The letter continued. I know you will try to refuse the inheritance. You are stubborn and proud, and you have this deeply held belief that accepting help somehow diminishes you. But please, Caroline, let me help you one final time. Let me give you the freedom to pursue your music without fear or limitation. Let me give you a safe place to live and the resources to build the life you deserve. This is not charity. This is gratitude. This is love of the purest kind, the love of a mentor for a student, of a friend for a friend, of a father for a daughter. Because that is what you became to me, Caroline. You became the daughter I needed in my final chapter, just as I hope I became something like a father to you. Caroline's tears fell onto the paper, smudging some of the ink, but she kept reading. My children will come around eventually. They are good people underneath their fear and anger. Play for them the way you played for me. Let the music speak for you. They will hear the truth in it, just as I did. They will understand that what we had was real and beautiful and worthy of respect. And when they do, I hope you will find it in your heart to forgive them and perhaps even to build relationships with them. They need someone like you in their lives, someone who values substance over status, someone who understands that wealth and privilege do not make you happy, that only authentic connection and purpose can do that. The letter was coming to an end. Live fully, Caroline. Play beautifully. Love generously. Do not let fear or other people's judgment keep you from becoming everything you are meant to be. You have a gift that brings light into dark places. Share that gift with the world. And remember that somewhere, somehow, I am listening and smiling with pride at everything you accomplish. You will always be in my heart, just as I hope I will remain in yours. With deepest affection and gratitude, Thomas. Caroline folded the letter carefully and held it against her chest. She sat in the quiet library, in the house that was now legally hers, and let herself finally, fully grieve. She cried for Thomas, for the friendship she had lost, for the father figure who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. She cried for her own father, gone these 3 years, who would have loved Thomas and who would have been proud of the way Caroline had handled this impossible situation. She cried for the person she used to be before debt and loss had stolen her dreams, and for the person she was becoming now, someone stronger and more resilient than she had ever imagined she could be. Eventually, the tears subsided. Caroline stood up from the piano bench and walked through the house, through rooms she had visited dozens of times during her friendship with Thomas but which now belonged to her in a way that still felt surreal. She climbed the grand staircase to the second floor and walked to the music room, the room that had been Margaret's and then Thomas's and now was hers. The Bosendorfer sat waiting for her, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light coming through the tall windows. Caroline sat down at the beloved piano and placed her hands on the keys. She did not play anything dramatic or technically difficult. Instead, she played a simple melody, one her father had taught her when she was very young, a lullaby about stars and dreams and the promises we make to the people we love. She played it softly, gently, as if the piano were a living thing that needed to be comforted. As if the house itself were grieving and needed to hear that everything would be all right, that music would continue to fill these rooms, that love had not ended with Thomas's death but had only changed form. When the melody ended, Caroline sat in silence, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle around her. Her life had changed irrevocably in the span of a few hours. She was now a wealthy woman, whether she wanted to be or not. She owned a mansion and a fortune in instruments and art. She had responsibilities and opportunities she had never imagined. But more than that, she had been given something even more valuable, vindication. The Whitmore family had heard her truth. They had seen her for who she really was. They had acknowledged that her love for Thomas had been genuine and that his love for her had been deserved. Caroline thought about the path forward. She would return to the New England Conservatory and complete her degree. She would work with the Whitmore family to establish the scholarship fund in Thomas and Margaret's names. She would give concerts and performances, sharing her gift with audiences who needed to hear music that spoke to their souls. She would build a life that honored both her father's memory and Thomas's generosity, a life that proved that dreams deferred are not dreams destroyed, merely dreams waiting for the right moment to bloom again. 6 months passed in a blur of transformation and renewal. Caroline moved into the Brookline estate permanently, though she spent the first few weeks feeling like an intruder in rooms that still carried Thomas's presence. She kept most of the staff, grateful for their familiar faces and their willingness to help her navigate the complexities of maintaining such a property. Gradually, the house stopped feeling like a museum and started feeling like home. She re-enrolled at the New England Conservatory, completing her final year with a focus and determination that surprised even her professors. Her classmates knew who she was, of course. The story of the billionaire's widow had made national news, and the narrative had shifted dramatically after details of the will reading emerged. Several people who had attended that day spoke to reporters about Caroline's performance and her decision to redistribute much of her inheritance. Public opinion, which had been viciously against her, turned sympathetic almost overnight. Caroline tried to ignore the attention and focus on what mattered, her music. She practiced 6 hours a day on the Bosendorfer, working with renewed purpose now that financial survival no longer consumed her thoughts. Her technique sharpened. Her interpretations deepened. She was becoming the pianist her father had always believed she could be, the pianist Thomas had seen in her from the very beginning. The Whitmore family kept their promises. Richard, Victoria, and James worked with Caroline to establish the Margaret and Thomas Whitmore Memorial Music Scholarship, endowing it with $20 million that would provide full tuition, room, and board for 15 students each year in perpetuity. Caroline served on the selection committee, reviewing applications from talented young musicians whose circumstances mirrored her own. Choosing the first cohort of recipients was one of the most meaningful experiences of her life. Her relationship with Thomas's children evolved slowly but genuinely. The monthly family dinners Richard had proposed became a regular tradition. Caroline got to know her step-nieces and step-nephews, who were curious about the aunt they had heard so much about. Victoria made good on her offer to help Caroline navigate high society, teaching her which events mattered and which were merely theater. James completed his 90-day rehab program and emerged committed to sobriety and self-improvement. He called Caroline once a week, often just to talk, and she became something of a confidant to him. But the most significant change came in Caroline's public performances. Word of her ability had spread throughout Boston's music community, and invitations began arriving for recitals, charity concerts, and collaborative performances. She accepted selectively, wanting to maintain the integrity of her art rather than become a society novelty. Each performance was carefully chosen, each venue meaningful. Her graduation recital at the conservatory drew an unexpectedly large crowd. The Whitmore family occupied the entire front row. Richard brought his wife and children. Victoria arrived with her new boyfriend, a kind man who owned an art gallery. James came sober and clear-eyed, proud to support the woman who had become his unlikely ally. Edward Whitmore and his wife attended, along with dozens of Thomas's friends and associates who wanted to hear the woman who had brought such joy to his final months. Caroline walked onto the stage in a simple black gown, her father's silver cross around her neck and Thomas's wedding ring on a chain beside it. She had not remarried and had no intention of doing so. Some loves were meant to be honored through memory rather than replacement. She sat at the concert grand piano and looked out at the audience. So many faces, so much history, so much expectation. But she felt no anxiety, only gratitude. She began with Chopin, moved through Rachmaninoff, and concluded with a piece she had composed herself, dedicated to Thomas. It was called Moonlight in Memory, a meditation on loss and gratitude, on the way grief and joy could coexist in a single heart. The audience listened in absolute silence, and when the final notes faded, the applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, and Caroline saw tears on faces throughout the hall. After the recital, she was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters. But the moment she treasured most came when Victoria pushed through the crowd and embraced her tightly. That was extraordinary. Dad would have been so proud. We're all so proud. James and Richard joined the embrace, and for a moment, they stood together as something resembling a real family, united by music and memory and hard-won understanding. In the weeks that followed, Caroline's life found its rhythm. She taught piano to scholarship students twice a week. She performed at carefully selected venues. She worked on her own compositions, finding that she had stories to tell through music that words could never capture. She visited her father's grave regularly, telling him about her life, about Thomas, about the strange and beautiful path that had led her here. The estate became a gathering place for musicians and artists. Caroline hosted salon evenings where emerging talents could perform for intimate audiences. The music room, once silent for years, now echoed with sound almost daily. Thomas's vision was being fulfilled, perhaps in ways even he had not imagined. On the first anniversary of Thomas's death, Caroline organized a memorial concert at Symphony Hall, with all proceeds going to the scholarship fund. She performed alongside some of Boston's finest musicians, and the event raised an additional $5 million. The Whitmore family sat together in the audience, no longer enemies or strangers, but people connected by love for a man who had brought them all together in unexpected ways. As Caroline took her final bow that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From drowning in debt and abandoned dreams to standing on one of the most prestigious stages in the country. From being accused of gold digging to being celebrated as an artist and philanthropist. From isolation to belonging to a family that had learned to see past their assumptions and prejudices. She had not asked for any of it. She had simply loved someone who deserved to be loved, and everything else had followed. That was the real story, the truth that the Will reading had finally revealed. Not a tale of manipulation or greed, but of genuine human connection transcending barriers of age and wealth and expectation. A story about how music could speak truth when words failed, how forgiveness could transform enemies into family, and how grace given freely could change everything. Caroline walked off the stage to embrace the Whitmores, and in that moment, she knew Thomas was somehow present, smiling at the family he had helped create through his final act of love and trust. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.